Hi, I'm Tanya Tarr. I'm a behavioral scientist and I'm a thinky brain.
And hi, I'm Katja Cahoon. I'm a psychotherapist and I'm a feely brain.
And this is Thinky Brain, Feely Brain, where we answer people's questions about things that are troubling them or challenging to them. And we offer those two perspectives and a few helpful tactics. So, how about we just get started, Katja? What do you think?
Let's dive in.
Yeah. Okay, so our first question is about grief actually, and this came from a reader who was wondering why there aren't better supports for grieving in the workplace, which is a really great and important. It's not a great question, but it's an important question right now because we're all kind of moving through this pandemic. Um, and I guess Katja, because this is definitely more up your alley, I'm wondering what you think about this, about supports for grieving in the workplace.
Yeah, Tanya, first of all, I think we don't have good supports for grief in general. It's one of those taboos. We don't like to think about it. We don't like to deal with it. We kind of hide our old people away, right? So that whole aspect of society is really already hidden, right? And then we give ourselves this short time frame to grieve, right? A short period, and then we're supposed to be done. So I think there are a couple of factors that play a role in that, unlike in other cultures, right, where there are grief ceremonies, grief rituals,
Mm.
where grieving is done in groups or where people come in and grieve together, right? We're sort of alone. We grieve alone. Maybe we have a partner or a therapist, but largely we're kind of alone. The other thing, and I don't mean this in a political way, is capitalism needs us to be functional. And grieving by its nature kind of makes us not so functional, right? There can be a slowing down, it can be difficult emotions, or we just don't feel, it can feel like a depression, right? So then we're not really able to be present at work. And I don't think work really recognizes that, right? Because we don't think about grief too much. We also don't necessarily have good policies or understanding in the workplace.
Well, there are usually, bereavement policies and things like that. I think the on the thinky brain side, what I would suggest, and what I did suggest to this reader, was that in her workplace, actually, they had really good policies around grieving, and her CEO told her, take whatever time that you need. They have like an employee EAP program, employee I can't remember what the A stands for, but they have resources that way. But I think the other piece of this is grieving right now feels very different. In fact, as we were talking before we got on this call, I recently lost someone just the other day, and he was battling cancer, so it wasn't unexpected. It was still upsetting, and I mourn his passing because he was a mentor. But I think during the pandemic, grieving has taken on another kind of dimension because people of all ages are passing away because of this terrible disease that we're battling. But on the thinky brain side of things, right? One tactic that you might want to consider is to have really, you know, open conversations with your supervisor, with your boss. One thing that I did many years ago with my bosses, because I am very thinky and cerebral, is I would work out certain phrases with them so that they knew if I had to take a timeout or if I had to drop off, that I would just have a certain phrase that I'd work out with that supervisor. So they understood that I wasn't, tuning out, but that I'm having a moment that is very unscheduled where I just need to tap out for a second. And then the other piece of it too is letting them know, if you can, like, I'm going to check in tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. So again, from like a cognitive behavioral and sort of workplace standpoint, as we're trying to figure out more sustainable ways and adaptive ways for us to work through the pandemic, communication is key. So finding out, you're establishing kind of a contract, you know what I mean, with your supervisor by saying, like, here's the key phrase. If I tell you this, it's because I'm walking through some serious grieving that keeps me from being able to be really present. And I'm coming back at 9 a.m. to check in on email or text or something like that. I feel like those two tactics can help build more texture, right? Because a lot of times workplaces are like, here's the number to the therapist, or just submit your bereavement time. And I think with this reader, I think she really also was trying to figure out, like, how do we have a conversation in the workplace that isn't oversharing, but is sort of to help her through that process. I don't, Katja, what do you know about the process, right? Because there's stages of grief I've read about.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. And so the lens I would put on, we need to give grief space, because if we don't, can become chronic, right? So the sense of giving grief space, because grief, like any emotion, is adaptive. And the role of grief really is to restructure our brain without that person or situation present, right? We can grieve the loss of a job or a home or something as well, right? So the slowing down that we sometimes feel, or the lack of productivity, is actually the brain is using resources to restructure because something is no longer there. So we need to give that space, right? And that goes back to having conversations with supervisors or colleagues, even coworkers. Yeah. Hey, I might not be as on the ball, or I might need some time, right? And to really negotiate that, like you say. Yeah. The other thing, yes, it is a process, right? So one really helpful model are the 5 stages of grief. We have denial, we have bargaining, we have anger, we have depression, sadness, and we have acceptance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those stages aren't linear, right? You might move from one to the other. You might come to a point of acceptance, and then something happens that triggers it open again, and whoop, there's maybe anger again or sadness. So giving yourself space for that and normalizing that is a normal response to a loss. And then having space for that in your own life as well, whether it's having rituals. Sometimes I suggest to people that I work with, write a letter to that person, all the things you couldn't say, or have a little altar or a little, photo area or something where you honor that person, what they meant to you. And so different rituals, because we're kind of short on rituals in our modern society.
Yeah, I agree.
Rituals, right? They help us heal. That's the point of rituals. That's why other cultures still have rituals around things like grief in particular, but also coming of age and other important life events.
Yeah, because like you're saying, it's a transition. And I really, really appreciate how you point out that grief is in and of itself adaptive, because you're adapting to a situation that has to be rebalanced or re-leveled out with the absence of someone or something that was meaningful to you, right? Mm-hmm. I think too a lot about this. I feel like grieving is something that the thinky brain is not well suited to understand, because the thinky brain is very linear and she wants the whole process to know what the process is and be done with it, right? Or that's my experience as a thinky brain. And to your point about grief being very nonlinear, there was someone very special to me, and the state federation president that I worked for, and she died very unexpectedly. She died in 2015, and in her sleep, they think of a heart attack. We didn't get to say goodbye or anything like it. Very, very unexpected. And I remember definitely in the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, like I spent a good 6 months being angry, and my coping mechanism was actually to have angry conversations with her in my head. It was how I processed. But I also remember that it took me 2 years before I had like the cry. Do you know what I mean, Katja? The cry, like when you finally are able to access the emotional part of that processing, which for thinky brains is very difficult. So I'm glad that Katja is throwing out all these wonderful tactics. Yeah. But it took 2 years. And the thing that actually, what happened was I was driving to the gym, and at work, I was dealing with some very difficult personalities, and I was waiting at a stoplight. I can even see in my head the stoplight, the day, all this stuff. And I was fine. But then I was at the stoplight and I thought, what would Linda tell me to do in this situation? And I had to pull over and cry for 15 minutes. That's when I had like the extreme sobbing, weeping cry that I couldn't have all the time up until that point. And to your point about it being nonlinear, it was just sort of like I was thinking about what she would advise, because I worked for her, but she also was incredibly wise. And for some reason, that moment, that question broke through. But it took 2 years. I mean, it was not. It's not a short process. And I think too, to your point about rituals, I love the idea of writing a letter to that person. Rituals really serve. I read an anthropologist, Angeles Arian, who said that rituals, and she studied, hundreds of cultures across the world and across different time periods. And, her take is that rituals help us with transition points. And on the Thinky Brain side, on the Thinky Brain side, we know the science shows us our brains want resolution. Our brains want openings and closings. And so finding a ritual or finding, a thing that you can do to honor that person and to honor the transition is going to help your brain cognitively close the loop, right?
Absolutely. Right. I mean, I think about my very first mentor, and he died over 20 years ago. And I still think about him, not in a sense of grief, but the role he's played, his importance, and the legacy he's left for me. He really taught me a lot of important things when I was at a still pretty young age, right? So honoring the legacy, whether it's through having conversations or what would that person advise, or can I live some of that person's characteristics in my own life, or values and so on. So I think that's also a way to deal with grief, is to realize, well, the person in their physical form is gone, but they still leave a lot behind that we can carry on or benefit from. And that's important to remember too.
Yeah. And I feel like if you are in a workplace where you can have these types of conversations, that, establishing those relationships with people where you can have discussions like this, it's not for everybody, but, having a conversation that honors that person that you've lost by remembering the things that inspired you the most about them, or, that memories that are really joyful or that really impacted you in a positive way. I feel like, not to make this too corporatized or whatever, but that is a conversation about leadership, because you're pointing out those characteristics that are core values that are important to you, so you can have that conversation in a really affirming way. And I think too, and we're about the same age, so I feel like in some spaces, like where I was when I worked in politics, like displaying emotion was very much trained out of us. And so again, I think if you are in a place, in a workplace, that being very consent-based about stuff can be useful. So finding and making those working relationships where you can be vulnerable and you can be emotional, and asking people, what their tolerance is. Because, and that also might surprise you, I don't like being emotional around people. I very much do not like crying in public, for a variety of reasons. Some of it is how I was trained. Some of it is cultural, because I'm half Korean, and just certain things we don't really do. But strong emotions do not bother me. And so people, and I will also add a little point of warning, like be careful when you let people know that you're good about showing emotions, because sometimes it felt like my office was a therapy session, as you will come and sit and tell me what was wrong and cry. But it doesn't, I think if you are in a workplace, you want to support your colleague, to let them know, like, strong emotions they don't harm me. I'm okay with them. If you need to talk and you cry, like, I'm here to hold space. I'm here to bear witness to this, if that is helpful to you, but to make it consent-based, right? To have those conversations. So the Thinky Brain tactic I would suggest for supporting others in grieving in the workplace is, the first is work out communication signals. So maybe there's some phrase that you can use with your supervisor or your CEO or your colleagues to let them know you have to step away, and to let them understand this. When I say, or I put this in Slack, this phrase means I need to just step away. And that also you let them know when you're coming back. So that kind of closes the loop. And then the other thing too is, in the workplace, if this is appropriate to your workplace, if you want to support others in their grieving process, to let them know that you're available for that, and that you can hold space for them, and that strong emotions don't upset you. And then also too, with that, I would say, and this is very Thinky Brain, like, you might want to also put sort of a time on that. Like, can I hold space for you for 30 minutes? Is that helpful? That kind of thing. I think the other piece too, that I think will come out through all of our conversations is, when we're navigating the pandemic, We don't want to rush things necessarily when it comes to this kind of stuff, but it can be overwhelming because for whatever reason. So sometimes when you put a time limit on things, it makes the action and the intention for the action more successful, because, you know, it's not like an open-ended 3-hour conversation. It's like, let's talk for 30 minutes. It might go for 3 hours.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yes, great points. I would say understand and normalize grief. So whether you're a supervisor or the person experiencing it, understand and normalize that grief is a process, that it can go up and down, that you or someone who works for you can be very productive one day and maybe, you know, have a little bit of a setback the next one, and to stay in communication about that as well, and not think that, oh gosh, they're not productive anymore, but this is part of grieving. And the other one is, this is more for the person experiencing the grief, have some rituals to help you through that, to give the grief some space, and to give your brain some time to restructure without that person or situation, so that you can heal and then return to balance, which is really the point of grief. Huh? So you know my tagline, it's all about befriending emotions. And this is really about befriending a very normal and actually helpful emotion. If we let it run its course, it will pass and go away.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Feely Brain.
Well, thank you, Thinky Brain.